Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and welcome to this Build With Me series featuring the 1/72nd scale Supermarine Spitfire Mk.Ia. So join me as I show you how I built this model kit, and feel free to put this video on in the background and build along with me. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So hopefully by the end of this video series, you should have a model which looks something like this. And in this first episode, I'm going to show you the basics on how to get started and to get familiarized with your kit. I have already built the Hawker Hurricane model kit, and that went into quite a deep dive. So let's assume you've seen some of that video. So I'm not going to go too deep into what this kit is. So this is the starter set version. You may have a slightly different version, which does or does not come with paint. So please make sure you read what it says on the box. On the back here, we've got our painting and decal placement instructions. So make sure you don't do anything with this box. Keep a hold of it. So inside this box, we should have some glue, a paintbrush, and some paints. As we go through this build, I will end up using a few extra bits and pieces. And some tools that you might want to get extra are some snips, a knife, and a sanding stick, just to get yourself going. You might want to get some more paints and some more brushes as well if you want to. But the stuff that's included in this kit should, at the bare minimum, bring you up to a basic standard of constructing the model. So let's get inside the box and briefly introduce the various elements that we have. So first up, we've got our instructions, which are definitely worth reading in their entirety before you start building the model. There are some extra hints and tips in here on things that I may or may not cover during the build. And then make sure you familiarize yourself with what's actually being told to you in these steps. So for example, in here, we've got part numbers, which are in the circles, and then paint numbers. So it also tells us how to paint our pilot and the internal cockpit areas as we move along. So just make sure you give a full read of all of these steps before you get to them. Also, pay attention to these various steps here with the question marks, as they are optional steps. So in this build in particular, you can either have the landing gear raised or lowered, but that is a decision that you're going to have to make before you get to that point, because if you don't, you can't then go back and change it. So the next thing to look at are the decals, and they come with a little bit of tracing paper which sits on the top just to protect them. Now these are water slide transfers, they're not stickers. I will show you how to apply them in this video, but you must take care of these because like I said, they're not stickers and they can be a little bit tricky at times. This set came with a number 2 thickness brush. These brushes are generally okay, but I will need to give it a bit of a wash to activate the nib there. So we'll put that away until we need it. We have a bag of paints. So make sure you check your paints. There was a small issue with the Humbrol pots in that they didn't quite seal correctly and the paints were drying out. So I'm going to give them a quick check. If you haven't got wet paint, so that's wet, that's usable, I will need to add a bit more water to it. If you haven't got wet paints, make sure you speak to the spares department at Airfix to get some new ones sent out to you. But for the moment, these all are wet so far, and I will be able to use them. The other little thing that we've got here is a tube of poly cement. This is the glue that we're going to use to assemble our model. If you want to use other poly cement such as Tamiya or Revell, they are effectively the same. Just in a slightly different format. So this will do the job, but there are better glues out there. This is effectively a little cheap one. And then finally in this bag, we have our plastic parts. So our plastic parts, we have 2 sprues of grey parts and 1 sprue containing a clear part. Make sure you keep an eye on where all these things are so that you don't lose them. And just looking at these parts here, you can see that all of the parts that we want are molded onto the frames with these little gates here. So we're going to have to cut them away eventually. But feeling the plastic, it feels a little bit oily. When they manufacture the kits, they use a mold release agent. It's a bit like when you do some baking and you use butter or oil to prevent food from sticking to your pans or baking trays. It's the same sort of deal when they come to mold plastic parts. So it feels a little bit greasy. I think the paints will struggle to stick to that. So the very first step I'm going to do with my kit, once I've made sure I've got all of the parts, is to give it a quick wash. So what I've got here is a pot of warm soapy water, just normal dish soap. I'm going to add a drop of vinegar into the mix because the acid in that will help break down some of the dirt and grime that we have on our plastic parts. Give it a good mix, and I've got this is an old toothbrush, and I'm going to use that to clean our plastic parts. So straight into your soapy mix, give it a good scrub, and then leave it to dry. And it's as simple as that. Do that to all of your parts, making sure you take care to not lose any in the process. Some of them are quite small. It is possible that you could knock them off and they fall into the tub. So just make sure before you pour the water away, you check the tub to make sure none of the plastic parts have inadvertently got stuck in the pot. If you lose a part, you can contact the spares department and get a new one possibly, but it is easier to just avoid losing them in the first place. It is something I've done in the past. So I'm going to leave these parts to air dry, and then I will be back with you. So my plastic parts are nearly dry, so we'll start doing some stuff with them in a minute. I think it's worth mentioning that this build will be based at a sort of beginner level of skill, but if you're an intermediate modeler, there might be some hints and tips in here for you. The paints then, so you only get 4 paints included in this kit, and we are going to be painting the internal parts of our model in this first episode. We've got a green, a sky type colour for the underside, that's Humble 90, a dark brown, and a matte black. All of these are going to require a bit of a mix, and maybe even thinning down with a little bit of water to get them to flow properly. If this is all you've got, then fair enough, crack on and do the build of these. However, over time, if like me, you've built a few models, you've got a few starter sets, and you've done a few things under your belt, you may end up with a few more paints and things to choose from. So during this build, I may dip into this box and find a more appropriate colour or something else that we can use in order to do things with, but it will be only a small amount of paint here and there. So you can see I've got lots of different colours, from reds, greens, blues, yellows, blacks. I think there's even some metallic colours in here as well. So if I use a colour that you don't feel you have to rush out to the shop and get one just so you can finish the model. Just keep it in mind for next time. It is a good idea when modelling to have a selection of paints, just generic colours, browns, greens, blacks, blues, sort of base colours, and some metallic ones. I'd suggest sort of some copper colour ones or some metallic ones, which I've probably got some metallic like silver. I think there's a silver in there. So the silver one, for example, will be fantastic for doing the landing gear legs and the wheels. But yeah, so as we go through, if I haven't quite got the right colour, I might end up mixing something as well. So let's see how that works out. So let's now start taking our parts away from our sprues. So I want all of the interior cockpit parts. So all I'm going to do is just very carefully nip them off with my cutters, taking care not to break them. And then once I've done that, all I'm going to do is sand down those little rough bits or excess plastic that I don't want with my sanding stick, just on the edges there, just to make it look a little bit tidier. Also, it will help them fit into their relevant slots and holes on the model as we go through and build it. So I need the various parts, including the bulkheads for the cockpit, and I also need to find the pilot and put him here as well. So I've got him. Just make sure you're not cutting off actual bits of detail, you're just cutting off the sprue gates which are holding the parts onto the frames. Just take your time to do this, there's no rush. It might be worth getting a small plastic pot or a little box to put these parts in once you've cut them away from the sprue, just so you don't lose them and you know where they all are. So now I've cut off my fuselage halves because we're going to paint the insides of those, and I've got these various components here, which are all for the inside of the cockpit, including the pilot. So it's up to you whether you include the pilot, it's completely your choice, but I am going to include him in this build. So I think that's the first one we're going to paint. There is a little bit of flash. So flash is extra plastic which shouldn't be there, which is left over from the molding process. So usually the molds are two-part molds, and the plastic, when it's injected into the mold, will seep between the two molds and leave extra plastic, and that's called flash. So what I'm going to do with my pilot figure is I'm going to take a little bit of this sticky tack and put it on the underside, and then stick a cocktail stick underneath him. So that gives me a relatively good way of being able to paint him as long as he stays on the stick. First up, we're going to use the dark earth brown paint, and I've been mixing it for a couple of minutes now just to make sure that it's been reactivated and is actually the color it's supposed to be. So we've got a nice brown color there. So this color is going to be painted onto our pilot, primarily the jacket and the trousers. So I'm using it straight out of the pot. I haven't bothered to thin it down. It's quite a thin paint already by the looks of it. Humbrol have changed their formulas in recent years, so it's not as thick and gloopy as it used to be. Just take your time with it, using your brush, just carefully paint the jacket and trousers. What I'm going to do with his goggles, I'll paint them black with the included black paint in a minute. And I'm going to probably dig into my extras box and find a flesh color for his face. So I'm going to wait for this paint to dry and then give him a second coat of this brown, because it's not quite covering enough as it is. Whilst I've got the brown paint out, I'm also going to apply it to the backrest of the chair for the cockpit. The rest of the cockpit area is going to be painted in a green colour. So we'll just get that bit in brown to sort of represent leather. Just going to put the black on the boots whilst we're waiting for the brown to dry. Just trying to make good use of my time. The black is a little bit thicker. It may only require one coat depending on how much you put on. This small part that I've got in my hand, this is the control panel. So I'm going to paint the top part of it here black as well, in preparation for the transfer. There's one decal which needs to go on this bit in a minute. So we'll do that before we effectively build this bit together, because it's so much easier to do it now than later. So just paint the top part here, the top flat bit, and also the reflector gun sight in black. This will probably need 2 coats because the paint isn't as thick as I thought it was. Moving back to the pilot, I've picked up a flesh colour, which is number 61 from my spares, or my stash as it were, and I'm using a very fine brush. Obviously, if you don't have a very fine brush, you could use a toothpick or a sharpened bit of plastic to apply your paint very carefully, but just a very, very tiny amount onto the face. You could, I suppose, even try mixing up some of the Humbrol 90, which is the sky type colour, and the brown, which you've got in the kit, to make a flesh kind of colour. But yeah, that'll do. There's my pilot. My pilot's pretty much ready. The life vest, if you wanted to go further, could be painted in yellow as well, to make him stand out if he ever has to jump out of his plane and go land in the sea. But as far as the starter set is concerned, this is pretty much your basic standard of how the pilot's going to look. So I mentioned earlier we've got a decal which needs to go onto the control panel, and it's this black one down here, number 6. So what I'm going to do is just cut it out from the paper, from the rest of them, and put the rest somewhere safe so I've got them. So what I've got here is a old plastic pot with some clean warm water in it, and my decal is going to go straight into there and soak up some water. It's only going to go in there for maybe 10-15 seconds. If you leave it in there too long, the transfer will start to peel away from your backing paper, and then it will start floating around in there, which isn't great. So we're just going to let the water do its magic put it on a bit of paper towel to soak up any excess. And then when it's ready, it will start to move, which is not quite ready yet. So we'll leave it a little bit longer. It might need a little bit more water, so just dip it back in if it does. Keep an eye on it. And then in a minute, that'll be ready to come off and we'll put it onto our model. So now it's moving around on the paper. So I'm going to take it off on my brush and very carefully, this is our control panel part. I'm going to put it in the correct place on the control panel part. You may need to use something with a pointy end like this cocktail stick just to get it in the right place. Just move it around. If it's not moving around too freely, just put some water underneath it. Just put a little bit of water on the part to help it move around. There are decal setting solutions out there in the modeling world, and what these things do is to help the decals soften down onto the plastic parts. It can make them look like they've been painted on. So there's loads of different ones out there. My normal go-to favorites are Microscale, Microset and Sol. It's a 2-part application process. Or you can use something like Humboldt Decal Fix. I know Tamiya do one. I'm pretty sure Rev will do one. There's loads. Absolutely loads of different decal setting solutions out there. So if you've got one, fantastic. Use it as per your manufacturer's instructions. If you haven't, not a massive deal. The decals in this set are from Cartograph and they are absolutely fantastic. So they should go onto the model without any real dramas. So just leave it now to settle down into the plastic, and don't be tempted to mess around with it too much, because you will run the risk of taking that transfer off of there. So leave it for like an hour just to settle down. If you are going to handle this part, be very careful and hold it where the transfer isn't, because otherwise it will come away in your finger. So the next step then is a bit of assembly. So it's the first bit of assembly we've done. I'm going to use my cocktail stick from earlier as my glue application tool. So open up your poly cement. Be careful, sometimes pressure likes to build up inside there. You can see the glue is starting to come out a little bit. Put a bit on the end of your cocktail stick and you're going to use that to apply it. So what we need to do is get our base for our cockpit, and I'm going to glue on the end here the frame for the bulkhead. I'm not entirely sure what this part is called, but it goes into its little slot quite neatly there on the back. Once that bit's done and it's snapped into place, just be super careful whilst you're handling these parts. You might want to go and get yourself some tweezers. Tweezers can be really handy for maneuvering small parts around as you build them. The chair, I would say, is the next part. So I'm going to be a little bit lazy here, but the chair goes onto these 4 mounting points. One there, one there, one there, and one there. So blobs of glue on there, taking care. And then we put our chair on here. Some of you might be wondering in the comments, you might be saying, oh, why haven't you painted all of these parts first? And the reason for that is because the glue will bond better if there's no paint on the parts. So if I had painted them, I would have had to gone through and remove paint from the various bonding surfaces. So this way, it means that I get a nice solid meld or weld effectively of the cement. The next part to add is the control column, which goes in a tiny little hole on the bottom in the middle there. There it is. Make sure you put it the right way round. It should be facing the pilot like that. He says, easier said than done. Our control panel part, which we painted previously, and it gets glued onto this mounting point here and this mounting point here. So a little bit of glue's on there. Obviously take care, my transfer hasn't quite settled down completely. So I'm going to be super careful to not dislodge it and get it in the right place. There we go. I'm just going to put that down and let the glue do its thing for a moment. And then we're going to start painting some stuff. What it is worth probably doing at this moment in time, there is a small part which needs to go on this little hole here. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue on there. And it's the tanks here. These, I think they're oxygen tanks for the pilot. And they mount onto the back there. So just going to do that. So they are now in the correct place on your fuselage. And effectively now what we've got to do is paint the fuselage interior and add our pilot and then glue it together. And that's the end of this episode. That will be the finishing point for this episode. So let's move on to that. So the cockpit interior, it doesn't actually tell you in the instructions what color to paint it, but from experience, I know that it's a kind of green. It's a lighter green than the green we're given in the actual set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix these up, make sure that they're thoroughly mixed as they should be. And then I'm going to do a bit of color matching with the paint that we've got in the set. So I'm going to take a bit of the green, the dark green, for which is part of the camouflage scheme. It's too dark at the moment to be a good match for the paint that should be used in the cockpit of the Spitfire. So I'm going to put some of that in my pot. I need a bit more than that. And then this is the sky underside color. And I'm going to use some of this, again, once we've mixed it all up. Get a good color on that. I'm going to use some of that to lighten up our existing green. So pop some of that in my mixing pot. Close that down. I'm getting it all over myself, these pots. Honestly, that's horrendous, isn't it? I'll be right back after I've washed my hands. And now that I'm clean enough to continue, I'm going to mix these two paints together. And that is much better. That is more like a cockpit interior green. You could go a little bit lighter than that. There's no exact science. It's down to your own personal preference. But that is a bit better than what we started with. There is a little bit of water. You can see that in my pot there. I like this pot because it has a sort of convex shape to it. So water pools around the edges from previous washing or whatever I've been using it for. So if I need to grab some water to help thin the paint a little bit, I can. But it's only like a drop at a time, which is really good. So all I'm going to do is simply brush it on the interior areas of the cockpit. So that's on both sides of the fuselage. We're going to do this one here. We're going to do this one over here. So all of this inside area here is going to be painted. And I'm also going to do any bit here, he says, anything on here which is still grey. So anything on this cockpit interior part which is still grey will have to be painted in this cockpit green colour. Do take your time, do take care and patience. We've already painted the control panel and the chair, and we've put our transfer on this one, so you just be careful that you don't get your green paint inadvertently on there. So that's just a bit of patience, bit of time. There's no rush, there's no need to go ahead and just throw loads of paint on here either. Just a little bit of paint on your brush at a time is enough to do the job. Here is our internal cockpit parts, and there's only just one more bit I want to do, and that's just to paint the very top of the control column in black. So using my very fine brush from earlier, I'm just going to use some black paint on there and touch up any bits that I've missed there. So again, if you haven't got a very fine brush, a cocktail stick would be good enough to do that. I do have a silver paint from a previous project, so I'm going to use that here. In the instructions, it tells you that these gas canisters for the oxygen are to be painted black, but I'm pretty sure on the actual aircraft they were an aluminium colour. So I'm going to use an aluminium, seeing as I've got one. If you don't have one, you know, feel free to use the black. So just carefully painting them in silver. Before we can start adding everything together, we just need to make sure that the paint is dry. But before we can glue the fuselage together, we do need to assemble our propeller parts, because they need to be put in before the fuselage is closed so that they can rotate freely when the model is completed. So, relatively simple way of doing this is to press the end in here. I'm going to add a tiny amount of glue, although I probably should wait first, actually. We'll wait until we get to the fuselage part. Oh no, we can probably do it now. You just need to make sure you get the right distance when you push that on there. So I'll put a tiny amount of glue on the end of my backing plate. So this flat bit with a protrusion is our backing plate. Tiny bit of glue on there. And then we push on our retaining part. And this is going to set it up so that it doesn't stop it from rotating freely. So now we need to press that down. It's a little bit tight. Push it down. And it needs to go so that we can have it rotating freely in there. That's probably a little bit too far out at the moment, so we need to push it a bit further. Just take your time and check your distance as you go. Closer, maybe another millimeter. So that's probably close enough, I think. So that should rotate nice and freely when it's installed in the model. And then the next bit to do would be to glue on our prop. The actual propeller goes on and it slots into its little grooves. And then a little bit more glue around the outside. And we put on our spinner, which goes over the top like that. So there you go. So propeller is now assembled, and that's ready for being added into our model in a minute. Now it's time to add our pilot. So it's always a good idea to test fit your parts before you assemble them, just to check. And you can see here that the pilot is ever so slightly too big. And the reason why is because in real life, pilots, people, are a bit squishy and they conform to the space in which they're required to occupy. But in plastic form, they're not so squishy. And the pilot here is kind of a generic pilot, which is included in a lot of kits. So his feet make him ever so slightly too long because they press up against the rudder pedals. So all I'm going to do, if I can find my snips, is cut his feet away, just so we've got a little bit more room to play in. It doesn't matter that he's got no feet, because you're not going to be able to see the fact he hasn't got feet. So now he's in there, he actually fits much better in his chair. So I'm going to put some glue in his chair, and you can see that obviously we've painted in there, so I'm going to remove a little bit of the paint just to give a better bonding surface for the glue. Put some glue in there, pilot goes in, and there he is. So that's a much better position than he was in before. As before, his head was way too high. Now his head is much lower, so you can see that's a much better seated position for him. Now that's done, we need to go and put our cockpit assembly inside of our fuselage. So once again, we've painted inside of there, so if you want to remove some paint from the various bonding surfaces, so it's like just here and here, and I think there was some along here as well, then that will help. So a bit of cement there, and a bit of cement there, just to help it go in. Naturally, I've not been particularly careful there with the glue application, but you can be as careful as you like. Use a toothpick if you fancy it. And just make sure that that goes in the right place. Make sure everything's level and seated correctly. There should be some little slots, little grooves along the edge on the back there, where it slots into to keep it in the right place. So just manipulate it around a little bit to make sure it actually is in the right place as the glue dries. So now with that in place, we're going to test fit the other fuselage half. It goes onto that one. It has little mounting points. They're little like pins which go into holes, and you just need to check that everything lines up correctly. If it doesn't, then there's probably something wrong. It's probably the inside parts. They just need moving around a little bit just to get them in the exactly right place. It's like the old rhyme, don't blame the kit, always test fit. But yeah, that looks like it will go together quite well. So we need to very carefully, minimal amount of glue. Make sure you don't get any in our mounting point for our prop. So just start off down here, a small amount of glue, run it along the edges there. That's probably too much. I've gone a bit excessive. Use your cocktail stick. I'm just doing this for speed. A little bit of glue, run it along your edges. And don't forget to add some on the cockpit parts we've already done, because they need to be glued into the wall. And then don't forget to put your propeller assembly in, because it should freely rotate, so make sure there's no cement in those areas. And then it's a little bit fiddly, but it's a matter of just lining everything up and holding it together whilst the cement cures. A little bit extra, just move it out the way. Just be careful you don't leave any thumbprints or fingerprints on the model as you go. And yeah, that is as far as we're going to go for episode 1 of this Build With Me series. In the next episode, we'll focus on completing the rest of this aircraft. And it shouldn't take too long because we're almost, I'd say, like 50–60% of the way towards having a completed plane sitting in front of us. Just make sure you let me know down in the comments what you thought of this build. Are you building along with me? And have you decided on whether you want to have your wheels down or your wheels up? I'm probably going to go wheels down so I can display it like that. But if you want to go wheels up, that is absolutely fine too, because you can have it flying around. Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and welcome back to the workbench for this, the second part of the Build With Me Supermarine Spitfire Mark 1 from Airfix. In the previous episode, we started this kit and we got as far as this stage here with our model assembled with the interior parts all inside and the fuselage closed up. In this episode, we're going to complete the majority of the assembly. So stick around and join in as we get stuck in with this Build With Me Supermarine Spitfire Mark 1 from Airfix. So as mentioned in the previous episode, this is aimed more at beginners and intermediate modelers. We're using some simple techniques. And if you don't have everything that I've got here, feel free to substitute or make do with what you do have available. But for the most part, we're going to be using some very simple skills and techniques to complete our model. If you haven't seen the previous episode, do go back and make sure you've checked that one out. So for now, though, we have assembled our aircraft and we need to get stuck in with finishing all of these parts off. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and cut away all the parts that I need from the sprue, but making sure that I remember or do things in order so I don't get them confused. So what I'm probably going to do first is start off with the tail surfaces. So I need B34, and just as before in the previous video, all of the parts are going to be snipped off the sprue with my cutter here. Any rough bits of plastic are then going to be sanded down just to make sure that we have some nice smooth parts with no excess plastic on them. This will help to ensure that we don't have tight fit or things that don't go in the right place. So I'm pretty sure, I'll probably put that on the wrong way, B34 goes on the other side. So we need to make sure we put them into the correct holes like that. As in the previous episode, we're using the tube glue that came in the kit. For the larger areas, you can just put it straight onto the parts that you want it to go onto. But for finer application, a cocktail stick would be a very helpful tool. So let's get these tail surfaces built up. Not a very long process. It's not a very big kit, really. Airfix have done quite a good job with this kit. I know this is like a 2010 tooling, so it's not one of their most recent kits, and you know, people do say, oh, it's got really deep panel lines, it's not the most detailed of kits out there in the world, which, you know, is true. It is what it is. It was a fairly simple Spitfire model kit, but it was much better than their previous offerings. It is one of the older kits in the Airfix range now, though, which will probably see a retooling at some point in the future. So up next is the rudder part. Again, snipping it away. Little bit of sanding just to improve the fit. Run some cement along the join area. And the rudder here has been designed so that if you wanted to position it at a different angle rather than straight on, so the rudder moves like that in real life, bear in mind whichever position you put it in, it will glue in that position. But I'm going to have mine straight forwards, but you could put yours in a different way if you wanted to. So that's those bits. I'm going to, shall I put them on? Normally I don't put the engine exhausts on. I paint them separately, but this is a fairly simple kit, so I probably could paint them on the model. So let's just stick them on and see how we get on with that. It just takes some careful painting. So number 22 goes on the port side of the model. Let's make sure we don't lose it. And it's got these little pins in it to make sure it goes, oh no, bent it. So be careful when you're doing that. It's got a very thin joints there between the exhaust parts. It's very thin, so just be super careful. And I do think I need my cocktail stick for this because they're very small. Bit of glue on there, bit of cement, and then run that down the insides of there. Be careful not to get the glue in the wrong places. You don't want it to melt too much plastic. And then stick it in. Done. Like I said in the previous episode, some tweezers might be a handy tool to help you build your model, but I haven't used any yet. Haven't really felt the need to use any. And then the one on the starboard side goes in as well. I mean, Airfix have done a good job of designing this. Everything fits together really nicely. There we go. So now our engine, exhausts, and our tail surfaces are on. One small point about the tail surfaces I probably should have mentioned earlier is try to get them horizontal so that they don't look like they're drooping to one side or another. Right, so that's that. Next are your wing surfaces. So let's get those off of the sprue. Clip. And again, just sand down those areas where we've removed them, just to make our assembly a little bit easier. And in the instructions, it does actually say to paint the inside area here black where the gun ports are. I haven't bothered on previous builds. I understand why they've done it. It's because these gun ports are visible, but they're not like hugely visible. I mean, I could be tempted to do that later. If it does bug me, I'll probably go back and do it later. Just put a little bit of black paint in each one after it's built. If you want to paint the insides black, absolutely feel free, but I don't see the need at the moment to do so. And I think the best way to do this, it doesn't really say in the instructions, it just says put everything together. So you can put it on first, and then I think that's probably the best way to do is put the bottom wing on first. So we'll run some glue along that. A little bit of glue in there, a tiny bit of glue there, and then down here on the back bit there, up the side there. So we'll put the bottom wing on first, and then we will join the upper wings. Just make sure you align it correctly, get everything nice and snug, and then we move on to our upper wings. And it's quite easy to do these. They can only go on one side. There we go. And you want to make sure that you get the seam down the wing root here nice and smooth, nice and flush, so that we don't have any gaps. And that one's gone on really well. Just press it together until the glue cures, and then repeat the process on the other side. Press that one into place as well. It may take a little bit of persuasion. That one doesn't quite want to go in. There is a mounting point on there, so you just need to make sure you put a little bit of pressure on. Be careful with the glue. Don't use too much because sticky fingerprints on the outside of the model are less than ideal. But yeah, that's come out all right. So now we need to focus on the lower side of the model. There are some details which need to be added. And it's kind of up to you a little bit whether you want to have your landing gear raised or lowered. My advice would be to leave the landing gear off until the end of the build, purely because it's easier to paint the internal areas and to paint the wheels if you want to have them separate. But you need to decide at this point what you're going to do, because if you don't, then, well, you might skip a step, you might miss something. Also, remember that you can't go back and change it once you've done it. These get glued in and they're very difficult to remove once you've done that. So it's down or raised, and you need to kind of decide. I'm going to have mine in the down position because it is a little bit more difficult. For raised, you just put one part in, you paint that bit black, and the rest of it's the same color as the underside of the model, and it's done. But for down, there is a wheel that you need to add. So I'm going to have mine in the down position. I am going to add the rest of the parts apart from the clear part, because the clear parts will go on at the very end of the build in the final episode. But everything else will be added onto the model now, more or less. So let's get on with that. So on the bottom of your aircraft, you've got a couple of positions for a few different bits and pieces. So this one on the left of the camera is an engine air intake radiator. So that's the wrong way around. Make sure you put it the right way around, and it just slots into its little hole like that. Then moving on, we've got another air intake over here. I think it's the oil cooler. That's the longer part like that. Make sure again that goes on the right way around. It should technically only fit in one way. Then once you've done that, it's this little air intake underneath here. So just put a little bit of glue. This comes in two parts. It goes into a little slot like that, and then there is another part which is just the front of it, which is a tiny little part, but it slots on as well like that. So yeah, just be super careful with that piece. It is very small. Again, tweezers might have been handy there, but I've had no issues. The tail wheel goes in its little hole at the back of the aircraft there. Make sure you put that one the right way round. Should only go in one way really. And make sure you push it in correctly so that it's in far enough. That is right. And then, so we have on the bottom here the pitot tube. Make sure we don't lose that. So the pitot tube goes onto this small hole on the end of the wing. This is that's the left wing, so it's the port wing, but obviously it's on the right hand side of the camera at the moment, so it's a little bit complicated, but yeah, that's the side it goes in. This is a small and fiddly part. Now that we're adding these small parts, you need to make sure that you're being careful whilst you're handling the model so you don't knock anything off as we go through the next few steps. Just make sure you push that one in. That should go in quite far. So the pitot tube measures air pressure, and by measuring the air pressure it measures the speed of the aircraft, which is quite fascinating. And that is the bottom of the model done for now. So landing gear will be done in a later episode. Clear landing light there, that will be done in another episode. Clear cockpit, that will be added probably in the final episode. And our final part to add today is the antenna aerial. There we go. So, well, this is the mast for the aerial. The aerial wire would run between here and here. And we may even add the aerial wire later as an extra. So that is our aircraft, probably about 98% built. So that's as far as we're going to take it in this episode today. I hope you've enjoyed it, possibly learned something new, or at the very least I've helped you complete your model. Let me know down in the comments, how are you building yours? Are you building yours with the wheels down or with your wheels raised? In the next episode, we're going to be focusing on painting our aircraft. Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and welcome back to part 3 of the 1/72nd scale Supermarine Spitfire Mk.Ia Build With Me series. In the previous episode, we completed our model to this point. This is now pretty much ready to go for some painting. So join me for episode 3 of the Build With Me Supermarine Spitfire Mark 1. So our Spitfire. The painting instructions come on the back of the box. So as you remember in the first episode, I said make sure you don't do anything with this. Make sure you keep hold of this because you are going to need it later. As you can see on here, we were given 4 paints included in the kit. We are going to paint our propeller in black, our undersides in this sky kind of colour, and we've got brown and dark green on the tops. I always find it a good idea to start from the lightest colour and then work our way to the darkest. It's always easier to paint a dark colour over a light colour. So I'm sure you can guess we're going to start with the Humbrol 90 sky colour. So we need to get that one ready. Make sure, just like in the previous episodes when we've done a bit of painting, that you give your paint pots a good mix, that they are ready to go before you start using them. Now, thinning paints. Paints aren't always ready to go from the pot. They may require additional thinning. So a good way to test is just to take a little bit out on your brush and pop it onto the model. If for whatever reason it just is too clumpy and you're going to leave brush marks, adding a drop of water, and it doesn't have to be lots of water, just a small amount of water may be beneficial. So I feel as though it may require a little bit of water. Like I said in the previous episode, because we've got small details on the aircraft now, I'm just going to be super careful as I handle this. A little pot, it does already have some water in it, and we just need a tiny amount to help our paint flow. Just ever so small amount. And then all we need to do is brush it onto the model. You can see the paint is being a bit reluctant to stick to the surface of the model, and there could be a couple of reasons for that. So the first reason was something that we tried to combat in the first episode of the series, which was where we washed it. We washed the kit with soapy water to remove any mold release that was on the model. The mold release is a type of oil which is used to help the plastic come out of the mold when it's being manufactured. But I thought that we'd removed the majority of that. Another reason could be that the plastic is just really smooth and the paint doesn't want to stick. So you can see as I brush it on, it doesn't really want to just stay where I leave it. It pulls up a little bit. So we're just going to manage that by carefully encouraging it to go where we want it. The paint is relatively thin. We've added a little bit of water just to help it flow. I'm literally just making my brush a little bit wet as we do this. And I'm alternating between the paint pot and water, just a little drop of each, just to make sure that we don't get any brush marks left. What the water's doing is increasing the drying time of the paint. And over that drying time, it will self-level and prevent brush strokes from being visible in the model. But thin coats are better than one thick coat. So I know it looks blotchy, but that will be fixed quite soon after we start applying a second coat or a third coat if it's needed. So the bottom of the aircraft is going to be painted in this sky color, and that includes the wheel wells here, because the best of my understanding is that the wheel wells on the Spitfire Mark 1s were painted the same color as the underside camouflage. So just make sure you get those the same color. I'm going to carry on with this. I'm going to paint it just the bottoms of the aircraft, and I will be back to see you for a second coat. Whilst I've got the paint out, I'm actually going to do the landing gear doors just to save a bit of time. The first layer is currently drying on the underside of the Spitfire, so I'm going to paint the doors here with the landing gear legs attached in the same underside color. Again, they'll probably need a couple of coats as the paint doesn't really want to stick. Could be partially down to the formula of the paint not wanting to play as such. A way to avoid this in the future, I know we tried washing the kit earlier, but you could use an alcohol-based thinner to help the paint settle a bit better, or you could use a spray primer or a primer coat of some description on the model. I normally go for a spray can primer because they dry quite quickly and they're really easy to use. You just spray it onto the aircraft, but that does require masking of previous areas that have been painted, such as the internal cockpit parts, because otherwise they will end up the same color as whatever the primer is. But what the primer paint will do will act as a key between the two layers effectively. So it's like the plastic, then the primer sticks to the plastic, and then the next paint layer sticks to the primer. So that's what a primer is really helpful for. It would have been really helpful in this build, but as you can see, we're just going to persevere, and we are going to get where we need to go. There we go. So the first layer is pretty much dry. It's not terrible, but it's a bit blotchy. Perhaps a second layer will be enough to finish off this base coat. So I'm just going to run the paint over the previously applied layer just to blend it all in. I'm working in one direction at the moment, and I may work in a second direction if I have to do a subsequent coat, which I think I might end up having to do because it doesn't seem to be quite enough. So we get the pitot tube there as well. Don't miss that bit out. Yeah, again, just a little bit of water and paint as well. One drop of each on the brush at the same time. The thinner the paint is, the less likely you are to have brush strokes in your finished surface. And then once again, I'm just going to go over all of the areas which are on the lower side of the model with this second coat, and I will see you when it's dry. So after 2 coats, it's not quite where I would like it to be. I think a third very thin coat will be needed just to make it a little less blotchy and a little bit more uniform. So just as before, a little bit of water, a little bit of paint, but this can be a very thin layer because we're almost there. We're almost where we want to be. So I worked in one direction on the previous layer. So in this layer, I'm probably going to work along the wing rather than front to back, just to prevent the buildup of any brush marks which may have occurred. So we're going to work in that direction there. So I'm going to do that all over the bottom of the aircraft once again, and I will see you once this is dry, ready for the next step. There we go. So layer number 3 is done and dry, and that's good enough for me. The opacity is pretty good and there aren't that many brush marks that I can see, so I'm pretty happy with that, and it's time to move on. So the next paint is the top camo. So if we get our box art back, you can see on the top we've got 2 different kinds of camouflage paint. We've got a brown and a green, and I think the simplest thing to do is just to paint the entire top surface in brown, and then when that's dry, go over the green camouflage parts as well. So 29 is our brown, so we're going to get that, and we're going to repeat the process just like before. A little bit of the brown paint, a little bit of water, which I've got in my pot here, just to give it a bit of an extra flow if we need it. This has been thoroughly mixed, and then carefully, we need to be more careful now. We can't be as sort of gung-ho as we were on the previous layer, because we need to preserve the lower layer to a certain extent. So at the edges of the wings here, we need to be a bit more careful because we want a nice clean edge, and we don't want it to be running onto the bottom side of the wings. Additionally, when we come down to do our edges here, we want to follow the molded lines, the panel lines along here, nice and gentle. You could, if you were worried you weren't going to get a nice neat edge here, you could use some masking tape along there, nice and straight edge for you to do that. But I'm going to just apply mine nice and carefully and take my time on the edge there. You can see that it's quite thin. We're getting that same issue that we had before where it doesn't really want to stick to the plastic. I'm inclined to believe that it could be because the formula for these paints has changed ever so slightly over the last couple of years, that they're not as happy to stick straight onto the plastic as they were before. The color does look a little bit different as well from previous issues of the Humbrol paint that I have used. The brown looks to be a little bit darker than normal, but we can carry on and use it. Obviously, when you're modeling, you can go out and buy the same colors but from different manufacturers. There's no issue with that. If that's the brand that you like the most, you want to use, I don't know, for example, Tamiya. Tamiya make quite a good range of acrylics. Feel free to use those. Vallejo, I quite like Vallejo paints as well. They're really nice to use. And there are naturally enamels and lacquers as well, which are different kinds of paint, which can be used for modeling with no real issues. So in time, if this is your first model, you may find different paints that you like to use more than acrylics, or vice versa. You might like acrylics more than enamels, for example. I am going to paint the engine exhaust in this brown color as a base layer, just so that it'll act as a primer basically for when we come to do them later. The front here is just like the edge at the back. You want to follow the molded panel line to get a nice straight edge. Again, you could use tape if you wanted to, but that's relatively good. I'm quite happy with that. That looks okay. And I'm going to just repeat that on the model. Make sure when you come around to the back here, you try and avoid getting it on the bottom of the horizontal surfaces. So just take your time, nice and gentle, just around the edge like that. There we go. So this is a little bit more care when applying this paint now. And I will see you when I've finished painting up the rest of this. Yeah, so first layer is down. Not particularly impressed with this brown colour. I have used considerably better, but we're just going to repeat the process and get another coat on. Exactly the same as we did with the earlier sky colour on the bottom. So just repeat the process. A bit of paint, a little bit of water, and apply it. Working in possibly a different direction to before. Again, taking care just to make sure we follow the lines that we've carefully painted on the sides so that we don't have any bleed onto the underside colour we've already carefully painted. So I'm going to just apply this second coat, and once again I will see you at the end to see how it looks, and maybe we might need a third one. Well, here we are after the third coat of paint now. I did it off screen, I just wanted to get it done, and it's still not looking great, is it? I'm starting to get some brush marks and it's still blotchy, so I'm not entirely sure what's happened in the Humbrol factory. I swear some of the older paints that came in different earlier gift sets were a bit better. I think I'm going to need to do one more layer of this paint. But it's getting on a bit thick now, but it's thick, but it hasn't got the opacity, which is strange. But yeah, so we're going to carry on. I'm going to do one more coat of this paint, and then I'm going to call it a day there. It is strange because other brands would have probably been one or two coats of this brown max, but now I'm on the third one and soon to be the fourth one. So I'm going to whack one more layer of paint onto this, and then we're going to move on to the green no matter what. I'm hoping, because there's already so much paint on here now, the green should go on in like one layer. We'll only need to do one coat of green. So fingers crossed for that, I guess. So I'll see you after the fourth coat. There we go. Number 4 going on. Still doesn't look 100%, does it? Like in some areas it's really good, and in other areas it's not good at all. Yeah, I think we're just going to have to call it a day after number 4. And move on with our lives to the green part of the camouflage. So with the brown now at 4 layers and looking a little bit questionable, but we're going to move on. It is time to put on our green, and the green goes on in a camouflage pattern as shown here. All I'm going to do is freehand this. I'm not going to do any masking or writing on here. I'm just going to get my paint. There's a little bit of water in my pot again in case I need it, just to add a little bit of extra liquid to the green. Green doesn't look too bad. Same brush as before. This is still the same brush that came in the set. I did use my thinner brush for smaller parts earlier, but this one will do for now. And all I'm going to do is follow the painting instructions on here. Just taking my time, nice and carefully. So we start off on this wingtip up here. We've got green coming up to there. Yeah, so this will need one coat of green, and then it starts about there and it comes down over to there and it goes all the way to about there. So this isn't an exact science, it's just doing my best. So naturally you could mask this if you wanted to. You could go and get some tape or some liquid masking fluids if you thought that would help, and you could draw on beforehand in a pencil where the green was going to go, but I'm quite happy to just do it like this. So I'm going to crack on with this. There we go. So we're coming up to the end of applying this first coat of paint, and I'm not going to need to do a second coat because the green has so much better opacity than the brown did. But it still doesn't look quite right to me. The shade looks a bit off. Can't quite put my finger on it, but the shade doesn't look quite right. So yeah, not really too sure, but we're nearly at the end of the camouflage scheme. Just done completely freehand. There we go. And that's it. That is the camouflage scheme done. So let's do a few extra bits of painting just to get this at a stage where we can finish for the day. So the black, which is number 33, that's the next one we're going to use. This one looked to be moderately okay, but again, it's been mixed in the pot and I have my water to hand, and I'm going to just take a little drop of water again just to help it along. And this is going to go onto our propeller at the front, all of the propeller area. But you just need to take care because we don't want to get it on any of the previously painted areas. So everything else needs to stay as it was. Again, this paint doesn't really want to stick, so just pick up a little bit more. Maybe it's a bit better when it's thicker, but being thick doesn't make it dry particularly well without brush marks, so we'll just have to manage. There we go. Because black paints being so pigment dense, normally you only really need one coat to get a good finish, but it would seem that this particular kind of paint is not of that particular ilk, as it were. So very carefully just painting our propeller, taking care to avoid the other areas we don't want to get. I will finish that, but whilst I'm here, we also want to paint the wheel on the back of the aircraft. So very carefully, again, just get the tyre. It doesn't matter so much if you do go over, because I'm going to use some aluminium paint that I used in the first episode to fill in the middle of the wheel. So just get the paint on there. This does go on better with the paint that was already on there. The engine exhausts as well, we can paint them black as per the instructions. The brown acting as a base layer for us, and that's worked out quite well. Just take your time, nice and careful. So this is pretty much built as per the instructions with the included paints. I've used a few extra paints to help me along. So I'll finish off painting the propeller in a minute, but before we move on, we need to also paint our wheels in the black. So it makes sense to paint everything with the same color whilst we put it out, and they can be just painted all over. I think in the instructions it just tells you to paint the whole thing black, which is fine, but I will go and turn the centers into aluminium color using the aluminium paint a little bit later. So that one's done, and I'll do the other one in a minute as well, and I'll see you shortly. Here is the clear canopy part. From previous experience, I know that this needs to be sanded down. It doesn't quite fit as it stands, so we need to remove some material from this side. So I'm going to get the plane out of the way. I don't want to get dust all over it. So just take your sanding stick and remove maybe 1 millimeter of material from the back end here. The reason I'm doing this now is because I want to paint this before we finish this episode. I want to show you how to paint the canopy. We're not going to install it on the kit, we're just going to paint it ready for installation in the next episode. So with a little bit of persuasion, we're going to test the fit, just to make sure that it actually does fit. And we don't have to remove any more material. But yeah, you can see with a little bit of pressure, it does go in. So that is about right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the canopy. To be honest, if you get it to fit like that, you won't even need to glue it. Press fit will be enough. It's quite hard to come off. There we go. So To paint this, we need the green again, because as you can see, it's in a completely green area of the camouflage scheme. So we're going to get the green out, and we need to follow the lines on the plastic part. I will probably get a cocktail stick and a bit more sticky tack and stick that to it to make it a little bit easier to handle. There we go. So we can handle it a bit easier without getting fingerprints all over it. So the green is back out, straight out of the pot this time, no thinning it. And then, brace your hands against themselves, and very carefully, you're using the edge, effectively, of the nib. You're not going point on, you're just following the canopy lines very carefully. Follow them all the way around. If you make a mistake, don't worry, you can remove excess acrylic paint with a cocktail stick if you need to, once it's dry. Very carefully, just following around. Just to point out, this is the number 2 brush, which was included in the kit. So even though it's not a particularly fine brush, I am able to get relatively good control with it. Not the highest quality brush, but it will do the job. Don't forget to do the little mirror at the top as well. Just follow it all the way around. This is probably going to be one of the more challenging steps of the build. The frames on this are relatively large, so it does make it quite easy to follow. Made a small error there, so I'll go back with my cocktail stick in a minute and remove that once it's dry. There we go, nice and easy. So I made a little small error there. I can go back and scrape that off when it's dry. Come on down the other side. There we go. So if you just carry on like that, you should get a fairly good result with your canopy. So I made the small error over here, and I'm just going to very carefully scrape away that bit of paint that I don't want to be there. I don't think I made a small one there. Scrape that away. And that's it. Everything else looks all right. As mentioned earlier, this is number 11. It's a silver color paint. It wasn't included in the set. It's something I have extra lying around. Just an extra little detail to pick out on the model to make things a little bit more interesting visually. So straight out of the pot, no messing about with thinners this time. The landing gear legs are molded onto the actual doors, so I'm going to just give them a quick coat of this silver color. I'll do both of the legs. If you don't have a silver color, don't worry too much about it. You can just leave them the same color as the landing gear doors are. And then once we've done that, we're going to keep the paint out because there is another thing we need to do with it, or I want to do with it at the very least, and that is to do the tail wheel. So you see this bit here, I am under the impression that on the real aircraft, this whole bit here was aluminium. We'll also do the center of the wheel. When I said earlier, don't worry too much about getting that one covered in black, it's because we're going to go over it now. Turn around. Nice and careful with the brush, not the best brush in the world, but it'll do the job. Trying to avoid the black. Just get it in the center of the wheel, that's it. And the very last bit on the plane that we need to do is the tip of the pitot tube, which is the sticky out bit there. Just going to get the bottom part of that in silver. You're not massively going to see that on the model, but we might as well do it. And before we put the paint away, the centers of the wheels need doing, the hubs. So they're on these sticks, which makes it easy. You can just sort of hold the brush in one place and then just rotate. Which makes it a little bit easier, I find. Very careful painting. And I'll do fronts and backs. Again, if you haven't got a silver color, don't worry too much about doing this step. You could do this, the wheel centers the same color as the Sky Type S as on the bottom of the model if you really wanted to. because that would probably be quite an appropriate colour to do if you wanted some visual interest like that. Before we finish this, there's one final painting step I want to do, and this is kind of optional. This doesn't come in the paint in the kit, but this is a satin paint. This is a clear coat, effectively, and this is going to help me with my decal application in the next episode. So what this is just another acrylic paint, but it's going to give a satin finish. So it's not 100% gloss, but it's sort of in between a matte finish like we have on the model here and a gloss finish, which makes it really shiny. So we're going to take some of that and a little bit of water, because I don't want too much, and I'm going to brush it over the majority of the aircraft. I'm not going to brush it over the propeller. I'm going to ignore the propeller. I'm just going to brush it over the areas where the transfers are going, really. So that's the main sort of body area for the wings, the fuselage, etc. And the reason why I'm doing this is because a smooth, glossy finish, not only does it give a uniform finish to the entire aircraft, it will create a uniform layer for the transfers to go to. Transfers or decals like a nice, smooth surface to stick to. And the shinier a surface is, the smoother generally it will be. So the transfers, when they stick down, they should avoid what's called silvering, which is little bubbles underneath, causing the transfer film to go all silvery and shiny, which we don't want when we apply our transfers. So this is going to hopefully prevent that when we come to do transfers in the next episode. If you have a gloss spray or something like that, that would be suitable as well. Basically, all we're doing is preparing the surface to receive transfers. If you don't have a gloss or a satin paint, and you just want to ignore this step and jump straight on to doing your transfers, that's fine. That's completely up to you. Just be prepared that you might get some silvering on your transfer film when they get put down. I will, in the next episode, when the transfers are in place, go back over the top in a matte varnish to dull this shine down, because I don't want the Spitfire to be too shiny when it's finished. So there we go. By now, your model should look something like this, and you can see that the satin finish has made it look a little bit more wet. I know it still is a little bit wet, but it has a sort of shine to it, which is really nice. So that is it for now. That is the end of this episode. At this point, you should still have your wheels, your landing gear legs, your landing light, your canopy not attached to the model. In the next episode, we are going to be putting the transfers or decals onto the model. So make sure that you are subscribed with notifications on so that you don't miss when that one comes out. Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and welcome back to the workbench for episode 4 of our Build With Me Spitfire Mark 1 series. So this is the kit that we're currently working on, and in the previous episode we got as far as here. So the majority of the assembly is complete and we have finished our painting. So in this episode it's time to apply these transfers. So join me as I get stuck in episode 4, where we should pretty much get this kit almost complete. We've already used one of the transfers, I think it was episode 1, which we cut out and have put inside the cockpit because it was for the control panel. For now though, what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do at the very least, is cut them into more manageable parts. So we haven't got that many transfers. We have 2 which go on the sides of the model. We have our roundels which go on the wings. And we also have our flashes which go on the tail and our registration numbers. So I'm going to remove those, and then just like I said in the very first episode, we need to carefully consult our instructions. And it's worth noting on our instructions that this one on the side here, so you can see we've got our DW, Roundel and NK. So these are our squadron and aircraft codes. You'll be able to notice that the actual registration of the aircraft, the tail number or the frame number, whatever you want to call it, is behind this transfer. So we need to put number 5 on the model first on the right hand side, so that we can then put this one over the top of it. So that's something that you need to make sure that you do. The other side down here, it doesn't matter because they aren't on top of each other. They are next to each other. This one is much further along. The reason why is because the roundels on both sides of the aircraft should be in exactly the same place. You know, sort of from the nose to there and from the nose to there, that should be the same distance. They're not off center. They should be in the same place on both sides. That means the letter's been pushed either side of it. And in this case, they've gone over the top of the registration number. So what we've done, we've cut our transfers out, and we need to start soaking these in warm water to release them from the backing paper. So I'm going to go ahead and get some warm water. As we've got the model in this position already, I'll just get rid of those, don't really need them there. I'm going to do the ones on the wings first. So dipping them in the warm water for a couple of seconds, maybe 10 to 15 seconds, not too long. You don't want to give them too much time because otherwise they will start to float away and then they become a right pain to catch in the pot. Pop them on some paper towel so the excess water wicks away, and then you'll need your brush. So this is again the brush that was included in the set. And all you need to do, a bit of more water, put it on the wing, make sure it goes in the right place, and carefully, you can see now that's sliding, slide it off into position. So I'm checking the actual instructions to see whereabouts it needs to go. It's more or less in line with that machine gun here, and we just slide it into place. If it's not quite in the right place, just maneuver it around a little bit and push it forward, perhaps a touch. There we go. So I'm just using water in this build because I imagine that if you're a beginner, and I'm hoping that this is the first kit for some people who are watching this, you probably wouldn't have any decal setting solutions. So decal setting solutions are special liquids which help your transfers soften into the surface details. These transfers in these Airfix kits are made by Cartograph, which is an Italian company, and they make absolutely amazing transfers. I absolutely love these Cartograph decals, and they should settle down to the surface details relatively okay. But a setting solution, such as the ones from Microscale or Tamiya or Humbrol or whoever you want to get them from, if you see it in the model shop, you pick some up, just follow the instructions on the bottle. But what they'll do is they'll make your transfers look like they have been painted on rather than just these plastic printed bits of film, really. So we'll just slide that across a little bit more to make it in the right place. So those are my wing transfers on. We'll move on to the ones on the sides. So like I said, I'm going to do the one which has the registration underneath it. So I'm going to do the registrations first. There aren't that many transfers on this kit, which is a good thing. And I do need one of these as well. We'll get that one soaking. Might as well get the other side ready as well whilst we're here, because we'll nearly be finished by that point. Get them all ready to go. So, looking at the instructions on the box, obviously be careful now handling this. We've got small parts on the model, and we've also got transfers. If you put your thumb in the wrong place, you could take the transfer off with your thumb. It will want to stick to your thumb because your thumb will be probably quite dry. So there is our registration code. That's going to go on the plane, and it goes just about there, in line with the oh, what's this? So I've got a little toothpick here. I'm just going to maneuver it around with a toothpick. There's like a frame, a bit of framework here, and it's in line with that. It's basically up against that, and it goes along the aircraft horizontally. So I'd say that is pretty much spot on. So we'll give that one a minute to settle down and become a bit more fixed to the surface, and we'll put the other one on the other side. Just be careful with them. They do like to stick to things. They do like to wrap themselves around stuff. Just be careful of that. You can manipulate them with a bit more water, and that should go in the same place, following the lines on there. So that's that one done. That might be a little bit wonky. You can press them down a little bit to make them stick a bit better. So now we're going to use the big ones, and I might do this side first just to give the other side a bit longer to stick itself down. It's a bit difficult doing this whilst holding it, so that is definitely in the wrong place. So we're going to move that. Naturally, be super careful with these now because these are big and thin transfers, and they will not like being played around with too much. So now get some water underneath them so that we can manipulate them. Remember in the previous episode I put a satin varnish coat on the model. That was because you see all of this has got plastic clear film behind it. If you have a matte finish, which is the previous finish we had on the model from the paints, it will be very sort of like dry, if that makes sense. It's not very smooth, and the decal film will have loads of little bubbles behind it, which are not very helpful for preventing them from what's called silvering. So the little air bubbles are visible behind, and they sort of bubble up, and it makes all of this clear stuff here look as if it's silver, which is not the effect that we're going for. So that is pretty much in the right place. It just needs to go back ever so slightly. It's not quite in the right place, but it's almost in the... Yeah, that's about right, looking at the instructions. So if you look on the instructions there, the bottom one, that is pretty much in the right place. So I'm pretty happy with that. So flipping over to the other side then, and we'll do the other big one nice and carefully. So we need to get the roundel in the same position, and it goes like that more or less, but we need to maneuver it carefully into place so that it's in the same place as the other roundel. So you can see there that they are aligned with each other more or less, and then the actual transfers should settle down over the top like that. Perhaps it needs to rotate ever so slightly. It's a bit high up there, so I'll just try and fix that. These little guys here, so these are almost like recognition flashes. They go on the tails. So once again, soak it in warm water, wait for it to release from the backing paper, and then one's going to go on this side and one's going to go on that side. But you need to make sure you put them in the right way round because they're red, white and blue. And the red should be pointing forwards in the direction of travel. So this one, which is number 4, is going to go, when it's ready, on this side closest to me. Once again, looking at the instructions to make sure I put it in the right place, but it pretty much goes at the top there. And then carefully position it. There we go. So that one's about right. And then we're going to flip over to the other side and put the last one on. So transfers. A lot of people don't like transfers. I think on a kit like this, where there aren't that many, this is like perfect to learn the basics of transfers or decals. Maneuvering them around. And the good thing about these is they're not so small that they get lost or stick to themselves. Transfers do have this nasty habit of when they are released from the backing paper of sticking to themselves and then wrapping themselves up into a tiny little roll, and then they become absolutely it's a horrendous job to get them unrolled from each other. Just there we go, just manipulating them. So over time these transfers will settle down onto the surface. They will start to stick down. I'm going to, just whilst that's happening, encourage them to do so by brushing on top of them to remove any air bubbles or water, excess water that might be underneath them. Just be careful because you don't want to move them in the process. You can see the ones on the wings now, since we've been doing this, they're starting to wrinkle up a little bit. That is normal. They will wrinkle up before they then flatten themselves back down again. That's perfectly fine. So just let them do it. When you've done this, just leave them alone. Just leave them to settle themselves. Don't be tempted to mess with them too much because you will end up either ripping them, removing them, moving them inadvertently. So yeah, just get them into place and then leave them to effectively cure. So when they've cured, I will see you again to put the next parts onto the model and move on. This curing process could take an hour, 2 hours. Maybe best thing to do would be to leave it overnight. If you do leave it overnight, maybe put like a box over the top to stop any dust from sticking to the model, just to keep it nice and clean. There we go, so I left this overnight, and as you can see now, the transfers have settled down into the surface of the plastic, and they look more like they've been painted on. And I don't seem to have much in the way of silvering. There's a tiny little bit down here, can't really see it. So they've gone on really well. I'm glad I put that satin coat down. So what I'm going to do now, and again this is an optional step, is I'm going to use this matte 49, which is a matte varnish, so it's a matte clear coat, on top of my transfers to dull down that shine. But I am going to mix in just a drop of the satin 135, which we used earlier, because the matte paint, this one from Humbrol in particular, will leave a sort of powdery chalky finish. They're leaving these like white marks all over the model, and I don't really want those. So I'm going to just mix in a tiny amount of satin varnish just to combat that. So just as before, a little bit of water in the pot, get my matte varnish in there, mix in the water, and then just a small amount of the satin as well, just to help prevent it from leaving that residue. And then just like when we prepared the surface for the transfers, all I'm going to do is brush it all over the model. So what this is going to do is give a uniform finish and help to dull down the shininess on the model. It's going to protect the transfers as well. So the transfers are effectively going to be sealed in to the model and prevent them from peeling or fading over time, hopefully. The transfers can yellow as time progresses, and I think that's related to an oxidization. And adding a clear coat like this should help prevent them from oxidizing with the air. So I'm going to apply this all over the aircraft, and then I will see you when it's dry. There we go, so that's pretty much dry, and you can see it's dulled down the shine a little bit, but everything is a lot more uniform. So what we're going to do is finish off the build of this model. So I'm going to flip it over because we need to put on some things on the bottom. And those would be, oh, that's fallen over. That would be the landing gear legs. So a small amount of glue as before, and you need to make sure they go the right way round. So the way that they go round is like this. They go in the little slots in there, and the sort of larger part of the landing gear cover points forwards. So we'll put a bit of glue on that leg, and then repeat the process on the other side. After we've done the legs, we'll need to add the wheels. And the wheels have a flat side to the tires. So if I pick this one up, you can see on there, let my hand, you can see on there that one edge is flat, the top edge up here is flat, and that's to simulate it being on the ground and the weight of the wheel is pushing through it. So what I'm going to do is put a little bit of glue, a little bit of cement on the axles. One on there, a bit on there, and then we're going to pop it on, and then before the cement starts to cure, I'm going to pop it up the other way around. Easier said than done. There we go. Put it actually on its wheels and make sure that they are at the correct orientation so that they are flat, which that is about right now. So I'm just rotating the wheels on the floor so that when it's sitting on the ground like that at an angle, the wheels are flat on the floor, with their flat bits flat on the floor. Like that. Yep, that looks about right. So make sure you check that. There is one more thing on the bottom that we need to put in, and I'm going to put the tube glue away. Clear parts aren't very good with this glue The glue does work, but what it ends up doing is reacting with the clear part and then forming, it's almost like it oxidizes it and it causes the clear part to fog up. It doesn't look clear anymore, it looks like it's milky. So if you don't have any other glue, then use absolutely the smallest amount of this cement that you can on your clear parts. I would recommend going and getting something like this. This is just a generic, this is Yoo-Hoo all-purpose adhesive. It's clear, it dries clear, it's a little bit stringy, so you have to combat that. But something like PVA wood glue, which dries clear, would also work perfectly fine. There are alternatively actual branded products which different companies such as Humbrol, Revell, etc., they make a clear kind of glue, which I'm pretty sure is just this but in a different packet. So the thing we do need to put on first, we're going to flip this guy back over, use my paint pots to help support it. In the bottom here, you can see we've got a hole, and the hole there is for a landing light, I am pretty sure. So I'm very carefully going to cut out this clear part, and it's so small that sanding it's going to be quite hard, so I'm using my knife, just very carefully trim off the excess plastic. Then a tiny amount of this glue. Is added to the hole, and this clear part, it has an almost conical shape, so this side that's closest to the camera, you can see that, is narrower than the bottom side, and it goes in with the narrow end first so that it has the wider side sticking out, and then just push it in all the way as far as it will go, like that. So that's now in, and then we're going to repeat the process with the Canopy, and the Canopy is pretty much a snap fit because we tested it earlier. So I'm going to use the smallest amount of this clear glue just on the bottom there and on the bottom there. See how it's stringy? So you've got to be careful with the strings, make sure we don't get any strings in the wrong place, and then press it into place. The glue will just make sure that it stays there. And that is pretty much a basic out-of-the-box build. So if you're happy and you've got to this point, then this is your kit now complete. However, I am going to do another episode, so if you tune in for the next one, we'll be looking at some basic ways to improve our basic model. But if you're happy with your kit at this point, then, well done, you've completed your Spitfire Mark 1 from Airfix. But like I said, in the next episode, there will be some basic tips on how to improve this a little further and make it look a little bit more realistic. Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and welcome to episode 5 of the Supermarine Spitfire Mark 1 Build With Me series. In the previous episode, we've finished our kit up to this standard here, but in this one, I'm going to show you a few simple techniques which can help enhance your model a little bit further. So join me in this video as I complete the series of this Build With Me Supermarine Spitfire Mark 1. Like I said in the previous episode, we're now at this point, and if this is as far as you want to go, then that is absolutely fine. There's no issue with that. Your model is now complete. However, I think there's a few things that we can do to help improve our model a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is add an aerial wire. So on the real aircraft, we had an aerial wire which ran from this point to this point here. And the way I'm going to do that is by taking some of the plastic. So this is the plastic from the frames on the outside of the kit when we started building it. I'm going to use some of this. And naturally, don't try this at home. I'm just going to show you what I do, but don't try this at home. So I'm going to stretch this sprue with some heat. So I've got myself a lighter and I'm just going to heat up the plastic in the middle. And when it starts to get a bit warm and a bit flexible, I'm then going to pull the two parts away from each other. See, it's starting to melt, and then pull them away from each other. And now I've got a thin plastic wire. There we go. Just let that cool down, put some tension on it, and then all I need to do is snip it at a sensible place. It's about the right length. So we've done that. Well, I need my sanding stick, which we've been using throughout this build, and I just need to take a little bit of the paint off of the end of here, just off the end of the aerial mast, and I'm going to take a little bit of the paint off of the top of the mast there as well, just so we get a better bond. The glue that we've used throughout the build as well, that's going to make a reappearance, and my cocktail stick for reapplying it. So the gel glue in this case is actually quite good because it helps the thing stay in the right place. A little bit on both points that we've just cleaned up. And then take your wire that we've just made, attach one end to there, and the other end to the top of the mast. Now that I've done that, I just need to snip away the excess. And just make sure that it has a bit of tension on it, because it should be sort of in a straight line. That doesn't look too bad. So the next thing to do to that, when the glue has dried, is to get our number 33, which was the matte black that we used at the, well, a couple of episodes ago. We used it on the propeller and the wheels. And we're just going to paint very carefully the aerial wire with this paint to make it blend in a bit more. I'm not going to bother thinning the paint. I'm just going to do it straight out of the pot. Just take your time, take some care. Don't knock it off. Don't inadvertently put your paint anywhere that we don't want it to go. And you'll have to do both sides just to make it look about right. And this just helps to hide the fact that it is just a piece of plastic that we've just stretched. Next up, the number 11, which is a silver, so any silver paint that you've got. I'm going to use this to simulate a bit of chipping. So chipping is where the paint on the surface of the aircraft has been worn away, and now the bare metal, the aluminium underneath, is starting to show through. So tiny amount on my brush, and I'm just going to pick out areas where the pilot and ground crew may have walked, just dabbing on a little bit of paint to make it appear as though they've been walking on the aircraft there. So that at the wing root is quite traditionally somewhere they would have done it. There may have been a little bit less on this side, so we'll do that as well. There is some panels here on the engine which would have been removed occasionally, so a tiny amount just to give the impression that some wear and tear has been done. Not too much. It is the absolute smallest amount of paint being used here, just to give the impression of chipping, paint being worn away. I will also do a tiny little bit around the gun bays where the armourers would remove the panels. Might remove that off of there, actually, that feels like too much. There we go, just a little bit around there, just to give the impression that these panels are removed. You don't want to go over the top, sometimes less is more. Like that. Put maybe some around the ailerons, because the ailerons are a moving part. A little bit on this side as well, just to repeat the effect. Chipping can be quite a handy tip or technique to use when you've made an error, and for example you've knocked some paint off of somewhere, or you've made a bit of a mess. You just hide it with some chipping. Say, oh, it was intentional the whole time. A little bit there, maybe a little bit on the rudder, just to simulate the bit where it moves. and on the tail surfaces there. Not much, absolutely tiny amount. Repeat it on the other side. Some around the landing gear and the ejector ports. There's panels on the bottom as well here that we can just do the edges of, and maybe the intake there, just a little bit on the edges. There we go, maybe a little bit on the leading edge of the landing gear bay doors. And now that we've done that, we'll add a little bit there actually. We could do a little bit of dry brushing. So dry brushing is a technique where you add paint to your brush and then you remove it again like that. So take it all off, and now I'm going to use what is essentially the residue on my engine exhausts, just like that, and it gives the impression of adding a bit of lightness to the engine exhausts, and it picks up the raised details but leaves the lower details in shadow, and it takes it from being just black to having a more metallic look. And we can repeat this on anything we want to repeat it on, really. We can repeat it just like on the edges of the wings, make it look like they've encountered some little bit of chipping as they've been going through the air. We can do it on the raised details down here, just so that they pick up the paint a little bit. We could do it on the blades of the propeller. I probably need a little bit more paint now. So pick your paint up and then remove it again. And you're just using the residue just on the edges there. It is a very subtle effect, but it adds a bit of visual interest to the aircraft. Maybe a little bit around the canopy, on the aerial mast maybe as well. There we go. So I'd say that's my chipping and dry brushing done. If we look on the box, there's a couple of things on here which I feel like we can replicate. On the wings, you'll see that there are some red, I think they were canvas panels on the gun ports. I think that's to highlight to people where the guns are. So I'm going to replicate that. I've got here a red number 60. Not entirely sure what the specific name is, but it will do. It's a little bit dried out, so I will add a tiny amount of water to it. I think that's about right. And then I'm very carefully going to add, or try to add as best I can, a bit of a square on each gun port. And I'm going to do the top sides first, and then I will flip the, I've missed one on that wing, I'll flip one over in a sec. Boom. There we go. And then just do the other side here, like that. If you wanted to, you could probably do this with some masking tape and then mask the area, but I feel like this is a good enough representation. Whilst I've got the red paint out, there is one more small thing that I want to do. On the port side, the light on the wingtip would have been red, so I'm going to make that one red here. It's very minimal. The starboard side would have been green, and it's already painted in green, so I'm just going to leave that one. So leave them to dry. Another detail I'd like to replicate is that on the tips of the propeller blades, you can see there's a yellow markation. I know these are spinning, it's a little bit hard to see, but the tips of the propeller blades were marked in yellow, so that the ground crew or whoever's operating around the aircraft can see where the extent of that dangerous part is. So if it's spinning, they don't walk into it. And it was on both the front and the back side. So I've got a 24, which is a yellow. And again, just a tiny amount on the brush. And then very carefully, just do the tips of the blades. Doesn't have to go too far. I'm just doing it freehand. Again, you could mask this if you wanted to, but the amount of time it takes to mask, I feel you could just get a straight line by just doing that. And we'll do the back sides as well. So the very last thing I want to do is to simulate some smoke and grime. Again, on the box artwork here, you can see that we've got some engine exhaust smoke here, and on the wings, the guns have got some gun smoke streaking across the aircraft there. So I'd like to represent that, and I have been very kindly provided with some powders from Humble. This was a free sample. All opinions remain my own though. They let me have a sample of this to try out. So you can see in here we've got a selection of different ones. I'm going to try out the smoke one, so let's dig that one out. If you don't have any powders, you could try some dry brushing like we did with the silver, just to go across the gun ports and those areas. But pastels work just as well. So if I was a betting man, I'd say the one on my right is the smoke, because it's not quite as dark as the one on the left. So we'll use that one. And for this, I have swapped out to a different brush. So this is another starter set brush that I've had. Obviously, it's seen a bit of wear and tear over the years. It's not perfect. It's a bit old and a bit tatty. But the one thing that is important about this brush is that it is completely dry. It's not wet in any way, which means that when we use this dust, we don't get it clumping and forming another kind of paint. We want it to be a powder. So there we can see our powder pigment in there, and I'm just going to pick a little bit up on my brush and work it into the brush ever so slightly. And then working in the direction of airflow. So we're going to start with our gun port here and then work backwards, and then just a little bit on each one. Like that. Where's the last one? There it is. Working in the direction of airflow as straight as you can get it. Don't have to go back too far on the wings, just enough to make it look as if the gun's been fired. There's not quite enough powder on that bit, so just pick up a tiny bit more. There we go. So I'd say that's about right for the top wing. We'll do the other side, and this just adds another layer of visual interest to the aircraft. Go a little bit more. It will show up a little bit better on the lower side because the lower side is much lighter in colour. And on the lower side, it's worth remembering that there is the ejector ports here as well. These are the holes in the wings on the bottom, and I would imagine that there would be some smoke residue coming out of those as well, because they're part of the gun mechanism. So we'll just add a little bit there. There are a few other bits and pieces. On the underside, we've got our engine radiator parts. It is possible that we have a few little leaks and things, so I'm just going to add a little bit of streaking there from them. Not masses, not going to go over the top, just a small amount to give the impression that perhaps some of the airflow is hot and it's burnt the underside, or there's a bit of a leak in some way. Minimal, but it's affecting the paint finish slightly. So I'd say that the gun smoke is done and the other side is done in the smoke department. There is a bit more I want to do, and that's just on the engine exhaust areas. So for the engine exhaust areas on the actual aircraft, you can see it doesn't just go in a straight line. It sort of curves down and away, which is where the airflow would be being forced. So it's a slightly curved affair. So we'll start off at the back here and then work our way round and down. And this may take up a little bit of a build-up, because obviously the engine is on the entire time the aircraft is in flight. So we may need a little bit more just to make it look particularly dirty. You want to also build it up more towards the engine and then have less of it as you streak it out away from the engine. Again, starting close to the engine and then streaking away. If you put too much on, you can just blow it away. So this was pretty much the final step. You could go even further and add washes to the panel lines. I'm not sure that at this point in time it's particularly worth it. Panel lines on the bottom are fairly visible, so they're not really worth adding a wash to. The top surfaces, because of those paints that we used, they've been filled in a little bit by the paint, so it won't be so great to add to that. So I'm not going to bother putting a wash on this. I don't really see the point at this moment in time. But if you'd like to learn more about doing a wash, I do have a tutorial on that, which you can find on my channel. But in a nutshell, I would say that at this point now, I'm pretty happy with this model, and this is where I'm going to leave it. So what we've done is we've taken a basic gift set starter set model with the included paints, added a few bits and pieces extra, and over the course of this series, we've ended up with a model that looks something like this. And I hope that if this was your first model and you've managed to follow along and you've built it with me, then you've really enjoyed what you've done and you've got the bug to carry on and get some more kits. As someone who reviews models, I think it's worth just mentioning that during the build of this kit, if I was doing a review, I'm not entirely sure that I'm 100% happy with those new Humbrol paints. So I've spoken about the colour of the paints and the opacity and the fact that, you know, they're a bit blotchy. This was the same kit, which I built a few years ago. Naturally, I've gone a bit crazy on it and I've put some battle damage on it, a bit more hardcore in that respect. It's a little bit old now, it's been sitting on the shelf, a little bit dusty, but you can see the difference in the paint colours there. The one on the left is the one we've just built with the included paints. The one on the right was done with the included paints at that time, so you can see that there is a marked difference there between the different paint qualities. The one on the left, the colours don't quite match. The brown is a little bit more red, the green is a little bit more vibrant, whereas on this side they're a little bit more darker. I also think that on this side here, this one it's more blotchy. The paint wasn't, the pigments weren't as good, whereas on this one the paint finish is a lot smoother. So as a review, I'd say maybe the paints aren't that great in these current sets. So going out and getting your own paints might be a good idea. I have used in the past Humbrol acrylics to airbrush the exact same kit. So now there's 3 of them on my bench. And you can see on this one, I added a panel line wash to it. It's a bit vibrant, but I did that pretty much to highlight how to do a panel line wash. So again, make sure you check out that video if you'd like to see that. Finally, I do have one more. And this one was airbrushed, but this one was airbrushed with Hataka airbrush ready paints. And once again, you can see that the paint color is different. Manufacturers will make the same paint essentially for the same reason, but they'll have slightly different shades. But out of all of them, I'd say that perhaps the one we built today is the one that looks a bit more cartoony and a little bit less as realistic as it potentially should. I'd say that these ones here are pretty much in line with the paint colours that probably would have been found on Spitfires during the Battle of Britain, whereas this one, not quite sure. So yeah, during your modelling hobby, you may well find different paints that you like to work with more than others. To finish off though, I've enjoyed building this model with you today, and I hope that you've enjoyed this series. Let me know down in the comments, how did you get on with your Spitfire, and what else would you like me to do in a Build With Me series on my channel? As always, quick shout out to my channel members and patrons. Massive thanks to these guys on screen for the support they give my channel. If you'd like to join them, take a look at the links in the description. If you enjoyed this one, dropping a like would be greatly appreciated. And if you're new here, subscribing with notifications on will mean you never miss a modelling upload. Finally, all that's left to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.